You will choose tonight, his grandmother said, snapping her fan shut against her palm like a magistrate's gavel. Or I shall choose for you, Julian, and I promise you will not like my taste. The Duke of Pennard did not turn from the tall windows of the Marchmont ballroom, where below him 100 candles doubled themselves in the black glass, and 100 young women arranged themselves like flowers cut for a table. He was 36 and had buried a wife 2 winters past, and he had come to London only because the Dowager Duchess had informed him, in a letter that brooked no argument, that a man who did not remarry left his lands to be squabbled over by cousins with weak chins and worse debts. I am aware of the arithmetic, grandmother, Julian said. You are aware of nothing but your own melancholy. Lady Adelaide Pennard was small and upright and 80 years old, and she had outlived 2 husbands, a king, and every rival who had ever underestimated her. She took her grandson's arm not because she needed the support, but because it allowed her to steer him. Come down, let them look at you. Let yourself look at them. That is all I ask this evening. Look, he came down. He always came down in the end, because she had raised him after the fever took his mother, and because beneath the iron of her there ran a vein of tenderness that had never once failed him, though she would have denied its existence to her grave. The ballroom parted before them the way water parts before the prow of a ship. He was tall and broad through the shoulder, and he wore black, because he had worn nothing else since Cassandra died, and the mothers of London had learned to read that black as opportunity rather than grief. Their daughters were presented to him in a bright, unending procession, each one curtsying to precisely the correct depth, each one with her name announced by a hovering mama, as though it were a card being played in a game of great stakes. Miss Featherstone, who laughed at everything he said before he had finished saying it. Miss Coleridge, who had memorized the acreage of his northern estate and recited it back to him as a compliment. The Honourable Miss Vane, whose beauty was so complete and so cold that looking at her was like looking at a marble bust of a woman rather than a woman herself. Julian bowed to each. He said the correct words. He felt nothing, and the nothing frightened him more than grief ever had, because grief at least was a kind of love turned inside out, and this was only emptiness wearing gloves. Well, his grandmother murmured as the 4th or 5th or 9th beauty drifted away in a rustle of satisfied silk. They are all very accomplished, he said. They are all very tiresome, she corrected, which is your fault as much as theirs, since you offer them nothing to catch. A woman show you her wit if you hand her only your silence to answer. Julian. She stopped. Her clawed little hand tightened on his sleeve. Do you know why I have brought you here tonight, of all the nights of the season, to marry me to the acreage of my own estates? To find you a wife who will make you look at the morning again, her old eyes, dark as his own, dark as every Pennard's for 300 years, moved across the ballroom with the shrewd, unhurried attention of a general surveying a field before a battle he already knew he would win. And I have. I found her a fortnight ago. You have simply not seen her yet because you have trained yourself so thoroughly not to see. He looked down at her. For the first time that evening something stirred in him that was not wariness. What have you done, grandmother? Nothing yet. She smiled, and it was a terrible and lovely thing, that smile, all the mischief of the girl she had once been surfacing through 8 decades of black lace. But I intend to. Dance with whom you like, drink what Marchmont's cellar can offer, endure the mothers. And when I raise my fan so you will come to me. That is all. Come to me when I raise my fan, and trust that I have never in your life steered you wrong. She left him then, gliding away into the crowd on the arm of an ancient earl, and Julian was alone in the middle of 100 beauties, more alone than he had been on the moors at Pennard in the dead of any winter. He did as he was told. He danced with Miss Featherstone, who laughed. He danced with Miss Coleridge, who quoted acreage. He accepted a glass of Marchmont's excellent claret and did not drink it, and the whole while some part of him, some old huntsman's instinct he had thought long dead, kept casting about the room as though searching for a thing it could not name. He found it at the edge of the light. She was standing where the candle glowed into shadow, near the servants' door through which the footmen passed with their trays, and she was not one of the 100. That was the first thing he understood about her, that she did not belong to the procession, was not a flower cut for the table, but a person who had somehow wandered in from a different and truer world. She wore grey. Not the fashionable dove grey of a lady's morning dress, but the honest grey of a gown that had been turned and mended and turned again, a serviceable, dignified grey, the grey of someone who worked. Her dark hair was pinned simply, with none of the feathers and jewels that trembled on every other head in the room, and a few strands had escaped to curl against a neck that no jeweller had ever touched. She was watching the dancers. Not with envy he knew envy, he had seen it on 100 faces that season, but with a kind of grave, private delight, the way a person watches a thing they love, and know they cannot have and have made their peace with wanting. She smiled at something, some turn of the dance, and the smile was so unguarded, so entirely for herself and no one else, that Julian felt it land somewhere behind his ribs like a stone dropped into a well he had believed had gone dry. "Who is she?" he said, to no one, and a passing acquaintance, Lord Devereux, whose function in life was to know. Everyone answered without being properly asked. "Who? The girl in grey?" "No one, Pennard. That is Miss Rowan. Lady Marchmont's companion, or her seamstress, or some such reads to the old woman, mends her lace, that sort of thing. Poor as a wren. Marchmont only allows her at the edges of these affairs to keep her within call. Not worth your notice." Devereux lowered his voice with the confidential ugliness of a man sharing a joke, "though I grant you she'd clean up handsomely, if a fellow were inclined to slum." Julian looked at him. He did not say anything. He had learned long ago that his silence, when he chose to weaponize it, could do more than any words, and Devereux's grin faltered and slid off his face like grease off a hot pan, and he found somewhere else to be. Miss Rowan. Julian turned the name over. He watched her a moment longer than was wise, and as though she felt the weight of his attention she must have felt it, for she looked up, her eyes found his across the whole width of the glittering room. She did not simper. She did not drop into the reflexive curtsy of a servant caught idling. She looked at him steadily, a woman meeting a man's gaze as an equal for the length of one held breath, and then a faint colour came into her cheeks and she looked away, back to the dancers, and Julian discovered that his heart was beating in a manner it had not troubled to do in a very long time. Across the ballroom, seated among the dowagers with an untouched glass of ratafia at her elbow, the Dowager Duchess of Pennard watched her grandson watch the girl in grey, and did not yet raise her fan. She was in no hurry. She had waited a fortnight. She could wait an hour more. It had begun that fortnight ago, with a Tournhem and a card table. Lady Adelaide had been at Marchmont House. For cards she played a vicious hand of whist, and had beggared half the peerage across a green baize table in her time, and she had caught her foot in the fringe of a carpet on the great stair, and gone down hard enough to frighten the young footman into uselessness. It was Miss Rowan who had come. Miss Rowan, who had knelt on the marble in her turned grey gown without a thought for it, who had taken the old woman's ringed hand in her own work-roughened ones and said low and calm, "Don't try to rise yet, ma'am. Breathe first. Nothing's broken, I've felt for it. You've bruised your pride and your hip, and both will want a moment." And how, Lady Adelaide had demanded when she could speak, does a lady's companion come to know what is and is not broken? "My father was a country surgeon, ma'am." A small wry smile. "I learned to set a bone before I learned to embroider. I am a great deal better at the one than the other, which has been the tragedy of my prospects." The dowager had laughed. She had not laughed, truly laughed, in longer than she cared to count. And it startled out of her there on the cold marble, and she had looked properly at the girl for the first time, at the intelligent, unfrightened eyes, the humour worn like armour over something that had clearly known grief, the competence in the hands, and Lady Adelaide Pennard, who had spent 60 years reading the true worth of people beneath the false coin of their circumstances, had known. She had known the way she knew a good horse or a bad marriage here. She had made inquiries, of course. One did not entrust a dukedom to instinct alone. And the inquiries had told her a story so common in its cruelty that it made her want to strike something. A surgeon's clever daughter, a girl raised with love and books, and no fortune at all, orphaned at 19 when the fever took her father as it took so many good men. A small inheritance swallowed by his debts. A slow descent through the only positions open to a gentlewoman without means, governess, companion, the genteel servitude of the useful poor. Eleanor Rowan was 24 and had been told, in 100 kind and unkind ways, that she was finished before she had begun, unmarriageable. No fortune, no family, no future, but the mending of another woman's lace until her eyes failed. The Ton had looked at Eleanor Rowan and seen nothing. Lady Adelaide had looked at her and seen the only woman in London who might teach her grandson to look at the morning again. So she had made her plans, as she made all her plans, in silence and in perfect confidence, and she had brought Julian to this ball. And she had told Lady Marchmont, a woman who owed the Dowager 3 separate favours and a gambling debt precisely, where along the wall her companion was to stand this evening, and in precisely what light. And now she sat among the Dowagers with her fan closed in her lap, and she watched the thing catch, watched her grandson's whole still body turn toward the girl in grey like a compass needle finding north, and something in her old fierce heart ease that had been clenched for 2 long years. Not yet, she told herself. Let him come to it himself. Let him think it his own. She did not raise the fan. Julian ought to have gone back to the procession. He knew it even as his feet carried him the other way, around the edge of the room, along the wall, toward the servant's door and the thinning light and the woman in grey who was not a flower cut for any table. She saw him coming. Of course she saw him. A duke in black moving deliberately across a crowded ballroom drew eyes the way a fire drew them, and by the time he reached her half the room had noticed the direction of his travel and begun, in that low collective murmur that is the true language of the Ton, to speculate. She did not flee, though he saw the impulse cross her face and be mastered. She lifted her chin and waited for him with her hands folded, a servant about to be given an instruction, bracing herself to be sent for shawls or reprimanded for standing where she should not. "Miss Rowan," he said. Something flickered in her eyes' surprise that he knew her name. "Your Grace, you know me? Everyone in this room knows you, Your Grace. You are the reason for it." A small pause, and then, with a dryness he had not expected and found he liked enormously, "You are, I believe, the prize." He almost smiled. He had not almost smiled in 2 years, and the muscles of his face seemed to have forgotten the shape of it. "And are you not competing for the prize, Miss Rowan?" "No, Your Grace." She said it simply, without bitterness, the way she might have observed that it was raining. "I am mending the prize's tablecloths. Lady Marchmont keeps me near in case a hem gives way during the dancing. It happens more than you would think. Silk is treacherous." "Is it? Beautiful and treacherous, Your Grace." "Most beautiful things are, in my experience. It is the plain, useful things one can trust." She glanced, just for an instant, at the whirling beauties on the floor, and then back at him, and there was no envy in it, only a clear-eyed accounting. "You will forgive me. I am forgetting my place. You should return to the floor. There are a great many young ladies who have prepared very hard to enchant you, and I am keeping you from them, and I will be blamed for it." "You are the least tiresome person I have spoken to all evening," Julian said, "and I have spoken to 40 of them. I am disinclined to hurry away from the first interesting conversation I have had in London." The colour came up in her cheeks again, but she held her ground. "That is a dangerous thing to say, companion, Your Grace, in a room full of watching mothers. You will ruin my situation. Lady Marchmont will not keep a companion the Duke of Pennard is seen to notice. It suggests things. It is untidy. Then Lady Marchmont is a fool." "Lady Marchmont pays my wages," Eleanor said, and now there was steel under the dryness, "which makes her judgment a matter of some importance to me, whatever it may be to you. You have a duchy to fall back upon, Your Grace." "I have a needle and my father's old medical books and the memory of a house that is no longer mine. You may find it charming to be reckless in a ballroom for an evening. I cannot afford charm. Please, go and dance." It was the bravest thing anyone had said to him in years, and she had said it with her heart plainly in her throat, and Julian understood that she was not refusing him out of coldness, but protecting the small, hard-won stability of a life that could be shattered by a single loose word from a careless great man. And he understood, with a clarity that struck him almost like grief, that he had been that careless great man his whole life and had never once had cause to know it. "Tell me about the medical books," he said, and did not go. So she told him, haltingly at first, and then because he asked real questions, because he did not laugh, because he leaned against the wall beside her as though a duke leaning in shadow beside a companion in grey were the most natural thing in the world, less haltingly. She told him about her father, the country surgeon, who had believed a physician's first duty was to the poor, because the rich could purchase incompetence at their leisure. She told him about riding out with him on winter nights to farms where a child was fevered or a mother laboring, about holding the lantern while he worked, about the smell of tallow and blood and the particular exhausted piece of a life pulled back from the edge. She told him about setting the blacksmith's arm when she was 15 because her father's own hands were shaking with the influenza that would kill him 3 years on. She did not tell it for pity. She told it the way a person tells the story of the best thing they ever were, and Julian, who had been born to more wealth than a country surgeon could imagine in 10 lifetimes, listened to her and felt something in himself that he could only call hunger. Not for her body, though she was lovelier the longer he looked, her plainness resolving under his attention into something far rarer than beauty. Hunger for the world she described, a world where a life meant something because of what it saved rather than what it owned. A world he had been too grand and too grieved to imagine. "You are staring at me, Your Grace," Eleanor said at last softly. "I am. Forgive me." He did not look away. "I have spent this entire evening being shown 100 women who wished me to look at them and could not manage it. And I have spent this quarter hour unable to look at anything else. I find I do not entirely understand it, and I am not a man accustomed to not understanding myself." Her breath caught. He heard it. And for one moment, one bright, perilous moment, the guard came down from her face entirely, and he saw the woman beneath it, saw longing there, saw that she was not made of stone or dry wit, but of the same aching, hopeful stuff as anyone, and that she had simply learned, as the poor must learn, to armor it well. Then she stepped back. "You must not," she whispered. "Please. Whatever this is, whatever kindness or curiosity or grief is moving you, you must not spend it on me. Because you will forget me by Michaelmas and go back to your moors, and I will be left here notorious and turned off without a character. It is not a fair game, Your Grace. You have everything to gain and nothing to lose, and I have nothing to gain and everything. Be kind and let me go." Across the ballroom, the Dowager Duchess of Pennard watched the girl's mouth shape the word go, and saw her grandson's face, and understood that the moment had come at last that Eleanor Rowan was about to save herself right out of the only happiness she would ever be offered, out of a decent fear that had been beaten into her by years of powerlessness, and that if someone did not act, this fragile, miraculous thing would dissolve back into the crowd and be lost. Lady Adelaide raised her fan. She raised it high and held it, and Julian, who had one thread of his attention forever tied to his grandmother, as a good captain keeps one eye always on the horizon, saw it lift above the sea of heads like a signal flag. "Come to me when I raise my fan." He looked at Eleanor Rowan, who was already half turned to slip away through the servant's door and out of his life, and he made, in the space of a heartbeat, the first decision of consequence he had made purely for himself in 2 long grieving years. "Come with me," he said, "Your Grace. My grandmother is asking for me. The Dowager Duchess of Pennard. She is old and formidable, and she has raised me since I was 7 years old, and when she summons me I go, and I would like you to come with me, not as a companion, not as a servant. As the woman I have been speaking with, whom I do not wish to have vanish the instant my back is turned." He held out his arm. It was, he knew, an outrageous thing to do, to offer a duke's arm to a lady's companion, in this room, before these eyes. He had spent his life avoiding outrage. He found, standing there with his arm out and his heart pounding, that he did not care in the slightest. "Please, Miss Rowan, take my arm, trust me for the length of one room. I promise you I am not playing a game." She looked at the offered arm. She looked at his face. And whatever she saw there, whatever the ruin of his old melancholy, and the terrifying new light behind it, she must have believed it, because after a long, trembling moment, Eleanor Rowan lifted her work-roughened hand and laid upon the sleeve of the Duke of Pennard, and let him lead her out into the light. He remembered, as he steadied her hand upon his arm and turned them both into the light, the last time a woman's hand had rested there. Cassandra's, on the day they had wed, gloved in white kid, cool and correct and dutiful. He had been fond of Cassandra. He would not lie to himself even now. He had been fond and grateful and comfortable, and he had grieved her honestly when the fever took her. But her hand had never trembled on his arm the way this one did, had never held to him as though he were a rail above a drop, had never made him aware of his own heartbeat as a thing he possessed and could feel. Fondness he understood. Walking was a still pond. This was a river. He had not known, in 36 years, that there was a difference. Eleanor walked beside him with her spine straight and her chin high and her whole face composed into the dignity of a woman who knows she's being stared at and refuses to give the starers the satisfaction of her flinching. Only her hand betrayed her, gripping his sleeve, and he laid his other hand over it for a moment, a small, sheltering pressure, and felt her steady. "Do not look at any of them," he murmured for her alone. "Look at me, or look at the door ahead, or look at nothing, but do not give them your eyes. They will read fear in them and feast on it. I know these people. I have been one of them my whole life. The only weapon that has ever silenced them is indifference, and I have a great deal of it to lend you. That is a strange sort of gallantry, your grace. It is the only sort I have. My grandmother trained me in no other." And he felt, rather than saw, the tremor of something that might, in a braver moment, have become a laugh. The ballroom saw them come. It could not fail to. A duke in black, the most sought prize of the season, walking the whole length of the Marchmont ballroom with Lady Marchmont's grey little companion upon his arm. The murmur that ran through the room was like wind through a field of barley, and it turned every head, and it dried up the music of 100 conversations into a single held breath. Miss Vane, the marble beauty, watched them pass with an expression that curdled from confidence to disbelief. The mothers of London clutched their fans. Lady Marchmont herself went the colour of her own claret and half rose from her chair, ready to intervene, to reprimand, to snatch her companion back and salvage the evening. And then she saw whom the Duke was walking toward, and she sat back down very quickly indeed. For the Dowager Duchess of Pennard had risen, small and upright and 80 years old. In her black lace and her mother's diamonds, she stood among the seated dowagers like a queen among her ladies, and she was smiling, she, who was famous across 3 decades of the peerage for never smiling at anything less than another woman's misfortune. She was smiling at the girl in grey with a warmth that stopped the whispers in their throats. Because whatever else the ton did not understand about the scene unfolding before them, they understood this. The Dowager Duchess of Pennard did not smile at nobodies. And if the old dragon was smiling, then the girl in grey was not a nobody, whatever any of them had thought a moment before. The ton could not read love, but it could read power, and it rearranged itself around power with the speed of long practice. "Grandmother," Julian said, stopping before her, and he did not let go of Eleanor's hand. "May I present Miss Eleanor Rowan?" "Miss Rowan, my grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Pennard." Eleanor curtsied. It was a beautiful curtsy, deep and grave, the curtsy of a gentlewoman, not a servant, and Lady Adelaide watched it, and knew she had been right a fortnight ago on the cold marble of the stair. "We have met," the dowager said. Her old eyes glittered, "though my grandson does not know it. This young woman knelt on Lady Marchmont's floor a fortnight past and told me nothing was broken, which was true, and that I had bruised my pride, which was truer, and she took my hand and did not let me feel like a foolish old woman for having fallen. I have not forgotten it." She looked at Julian, and her whole shrewd, tender, triumphant heart was in her face. "Have you enjoyed your evening, Julian? Have you looked as I asked you to look?" "I have looked, grandmother," he said quietly, "and I have found." The old woman's chin trembled just once, and was mastered. "Then I am content," she said. "Sit, both of you. Sit here beside me where the whole insufferable room can see you, and let them talk themselves hoarse, and pay them no mind at all. Miss Rowan, you will take my ratafia. I never drink the wretched stuff. It is here only to give my hands something to hold, and you will tell my grandson about the winter you set the blacksmith's arm, because I can see from his face that he has not heard the half of you yet. And I intend to enjoy watching him hear the rest." Eleanor sat. She was pale, and her hand still trembled faintly in Julian's, and she leaned close to the old Duchess and said, under the returning swell of the music, in a voice pitched for the dowager alone, "Ma'am, you are very kind. But you must know what this looks like, and what it will cost me when it ends. I am a companion. I have no fortune and no name. He is a duke. This cannot be what it seems, and when he tires of it, I am the one who will be ruined by it. I would rather be sent back to the wall now, tonight, than be made a spectacle and thrown away tomorrow. and Lady Adelaide Pennard leaned close in her turn, and took the girl's frightened face in one ancient jewelled hand and said, so that only Eleanor could hear it, "My child, do you imagine I did not arrange every particle of this? The light you stood in, the place along the wall. I chose you a fortnight ago on that marble floor, and I have spent every day since making certain my grandson would be brought to the one place in London where he might see you as I saw you. You are not a spectacle, Eleanor Rowan. You are the answer to a prayer I did not know I was permitted to make. Now stop being brave and let yourself be loved. It is the harder thing, I know. Do it anyway." Eleanor Rowan, who had not wept in front of anyone in 5 years, who had learned to armor her heart against exactly the hope now being pressed into her hands, put her fingers to her mouth and wept silently, helplessly, the tears standing in her eyes and spilling over, and the old Duchess held her face and let her. And Julian sat on her other side with his hand around hers, and the whole glittering ballroom watched 3 people it did not understand and drew, at last, the only conclusion available to it, that something had changed, that the game was over, that the prize had been won by the one woman in the room who had never entered the contest. He did not propose that night. He was not a fool, and neither was his grandmother, and Eleanor Rowan was not a woman to be won by a single ballroom gesture, however grand. What he did was harder and slower and worth more. He courted her. He came to Marchmont House by daylight, in a plain coat, and asked Lady Marchmont's leave to walk her companion in the garden, and Lady Marchmont, who could count the shift of the wind as well as anyone, gave it with a graciousness she did not feel and would spend months pretending she had felt all along. He walked with Eleanor among the box hedges and asked her about medicine, and let her ask him about his moors, his tenants, the fever that had taken Cassandra, and the 2 grey years after it in which he had let his own heart go untended like a fallow field. He told her things he had told no one. He found that her father's hard, kind creed that a life meant what it saved, and not what it owned, had lodged in him like a splinter working its slow way toward the surface, and that he wanted, for the first time, since he had inherited his acres and his griefs, to be a man whose greatness lay in what he mended rather than what he possessed. There was one afternoon, some 3 weeks into the courtship, that Julian would carry with him to the end of his days. A stable boy at Marchmont House had been kicked by a nervous carriage horse and lay white and moaning on the straw with his arm bent at an angle no arm should hold, and the household was in an uproar, and the surgeon a day's ride off. And it was Eleanor, forgetting entirely that a duke stood watching, forgetting her mended dignity and her careful place, who knelt in the muck of the stable yard in her second-best gown, and took charge as though she had been born to it. Julian watched her set the boy's arm. He watched her calm the whole panicked yard with the low, even authority of her voice, watched her splint the arm with a groom's cut whipstock and strips torn from her own petticoat, watched her wipe the sweat from the boy's forehead, and tell him he was braver than any soldier, and would have a fine story to frighten the maids with. And when it was done and the boy was carried in to rest, she rose from the straw with blood on her sleeves and her hair come loose about her face, and turned saw the Duke of Pennard standing at the gate of the stable yard, watching her with an expression that undid her entirely. "I have ruined my gown," she said foolishly, because she did not know what else to say, "and likely my character. A lady does not kneel in stable muck." "A lady," Julian said, and his voice was not quite steady, "does precisely what you have just done, and I have never in my life seen anything I wanted more to keep. There is a village near Pennard," he told her another afternoon, "that has had no surgeon in 11 years. The nearest is a day's ride, and by the time he comes the child is dead, or the arm has set crooked, or the fever has taken the whole house. I have let it go on because it was not the way things had always been done, and a duke is trained above all things to do things the way they have always been done." He looked at her, this clever, brave, worn-down woman his grandmother had plucked from the shadows and set into the center of his life. "I should like to build them a house of healing, and I should like a woman who knows how to hold a lantern and set a bone to help me see it built, not as my companion, not as my project, as my Duchess Eleanor, as my wife. If she will have a grieving fool who did not know how to look at the morning until he saw her mending tablecloths in the dark." Eleanor Rowan looked at him for a long time. The box hedges were green around them, and the autumn light came golden and low across the garden, and somewhere behind a window an old woman was almost certainly watching, and pretending she was not. "My father," Eleanor said at last, and her voice shook, "used to say that the truest medicine was to be seen, that half of what ailed the poor was that no one of consequence had ever once truly looked at them. I did not understand him fully until a fortnight ago, when a duke crossed a whole ballroom toward a girl in a mended grey gown and looked." She put a roughened hand against his jaw, this untouchable great man who had made himself touchable for her. "Yes, Julian, God help us both, yes. I will have you. I will help you build your house of healing, and I will love your terrifying grandmother until she admits she has a heart, and I will spend the rest of my life being looked at by one man in England who thought to look, yes." There was, before the wedding, one further scene that belonged to the old woman who had begun it all. The Dowager Duchess of Pennard summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room a week before the banns were read, and dismissed her maid, and made the girl who would be her granddaughter sit knee to knee with her by the fire. "You will wonder all your life," she said, "why an old dragon should have troubled herself over a companion in a mended gown. I will tell you once, and then never again, because sentiment is a weakness, and I have kept mine hidden for 80 years. She turned her rings upon her fingers, the fire catching in the old diamonds. When I was younger than you, I loved a man my family thought beneath me. A surgeon's son, as it happens the world has a cruel sense of symmetry. They forbade it. I married my duke and did my duty and was not unhappy exactly for 60 years. But I never once looked at a morning the way I would have looked at it beside him. When I saw you kneel on that marble floor and take my hand, I saw the girl I had been, and I thought, not this one. This one shall have her morning." She gripped Eleanor's hand with a strength that startled. "So you will marry my grandson and love him fiercely, and build your house of healing, and you will not thank me. You will simply be happy. That is all the thanks a meddling old woman requires." They were married at Pennard in the spring, in the small grey church at the edge of the moor, with the whole village crowded in behind the gentry because the new duchess had asked it so. The Dowager Duchess of Pennard sat in the front pew in her mother's diamonds and did not smile at anyone's misfortune, for once, because there was none to be found in that whole full church, only a girl in a wedding gown of honest cream who had once worn mended grey, and a man in black who wore, at last, a sprig of green at his breast, and who watched her come up the aisle toward him as though the morning had finally, after 2 long winters, decided to break. The House of Healing was built the following year. They named it for a country surgeon no one grand had ever heard of. And in the village near Pennard, when the old people speak of it now, they do not say the Duke built it, though he paid for every stone. They say the Duchess built it, the one who came from nowhere, the one the great old Dowager chose, the one who knew how to hold a lantern in the dark and set a broken thing straight, and they are, all of them, entirely right.